Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Sunday Morning Science. John Perry here. Today we're going to talk about signaling theory, and I'm really excited about this. I've been working with Stuart West at Oxford over the past few years. We did one video on evolutionary transitions, major evolutionary transitions, several years back, and right now we're starting to work on a few more on some genetics animations, which will be coming out fairly soon on the Stated Clearly channel. Before that, I've got another animation on Origin of Life that I'm working on right now, like at the moment right now. But so I've been working with Stuart West for a long time, and he has written a textbook about it covers a lot of different topics in evolution, but one that's been most impactful on me is signaling theory. And it's really a beautiful piece of evolutionary science. So I'm excited to talk about that. Before I get going there, I want to just let you know what's happening the rest of this month on Sunday Morning Science. So let me pull up my slides here. So next week, I'm going to have Jay Forsythe on, and he is an Origin of Life chemist, and he's also a Christian, and he's going to be talking about mostly about his chemistry, but then we're also going to dive into a little bit of the religious aspect of this. There's actually several Christian researchers at the Origin of Life Research Center, and it's pretty interesting to see his perspective. I've had a couple people on here as guests that are very much against Origin of Life chemistry because of their religious thought, and he's obviously very different than they are. So it's going to be interesting to talk to him about that. And then I've got Bert Hubert coming on, and he is an engineer, and he's going to be talking about the cell. He's actually studied biology professionally. But he started his career as an engineer, and he's going to be talking about the cell from an engineering perspective, and it's going to be really cool to have a conversation with him. He's got a couple of talks online about this that I've really, really enjoyed. So, yeah, I'm excited to have him on. So it's going to be a great couple weeks coming up here. Sorry, I just had to make sure that everything was streaming properly. Okay, so signaling theory. Signaling in nature, pretty much all the things that make you say, whoa. Like, whoa, that's cool. The strange colors of a flower, the colorings of a bird, the song of a bird, the bizarre colors on a butterfly, all of these things are signaling, and pretty much everything that really blows your mind when you go out in nature, the things that make you stop and look, those are signals. The reason that they grab our attention is because they've actually evolved to get attention, usually not from us, but from, a bird's song is for other birds. Flowers, beautiful colors are to attract insects for pollination. And the butterflies have their colors to attract mates and to signal what species they are, so that other butterflies know that it's cool to hang out with them. And there's also signaling that butterflies might be doing to predators, signaling that they might be toxic, and so on. So there's all sorts of signaling happening in nature. Organisms are communicating with each other, and oftentimes organisms without brains are communicating with each other, as is the case of plants that communicate with insects through their flowers. And plants actually communicate a lot through molecular signaling that happens in their roots with fungi, and there's all sorts of communication. You do not need a brain to communicate, it turns out. And this is just a really weird and fascinating aspect of biology. We have layers and layers of communication systems happening. Now, my talk today is going to be pretty much a lot of it's going to be based on Stuart West's book, which is An Introduction to Behavioral Ecology. And this is the textbook that he uses in one of his classes at Oxford. He wrote with 2 other co-authors. And a lot of this is also going to be coming from this paper. I'm kind of mixing and matching fields here. I told you I'm going to have an engineer on to talk about the cell from an engineering perspective. And there is this beautiful paper by Claude Shannon. This was back, 1948. And it's a mathematical theory of communication. And this is not really used by biologists. Biologists don't normally talk about communication in this way, but I think that they should, because what he's described here, he worked for Bell Labs, for the phone company, and he was trying to really understand what communication is at a fundamental level, and he wrote this paper, and it is absolutely amazing, the insights that he gave us. And it's directly applicable to biology, directly applicable. And I'm going to be talking about this in light of signaling theory. So signaling theory is this actual thing that developed within the field of evolutionary biology. And then this mathematical theory of communication came about independently in engineering. And this has been the basis of a lot of computer science. Pardon my crackly voice this morning. So signaling theory is that branch of evolutionary biology that studies how communication systems evolve or develop between organisms, even organisms without brains. And then the information theory is this universal mathematical description of communication. So this graph right here is very famous in Claude Shannon's paper. And he talks about what a communication system is. You've got an information source. You have a transmitter of some kind, transmitter and an encoder. So that transmitter, if we think about a flower, for example, of course he was thinking about phones and stuff. But if we think about this in biology, a flower is encoding information. It's encoding information about the fact that it's got pollen that's ready to be spread about the world. And it has nectar that's ready to be fed to pollinating insects so that they can, do their job to spread that pollen. And it encodes that information. So that information exists inside the plant, and it encodes that information in colors of the flower and in fragrances. And there's actually a lot of pretty complicated signals that are being transmitted by a flower. Very specific. Some are species specific. They're actually communicating with a specific species of insect. And, they have special fragrances that attract specific species and repel others. But that is encoded in these fragrances and in these colors and transmitted. It is a signal that is transmitted. The fragrances can be smelled from quite a distance away, and the colors can be seen from quite a distance away. And it's transmitted through a noisy source, just the environment. And that is received by the eyes and the sensory organisms of an insect, which decode that information into some sort of a meaning that the insect understands. So the destination here is the insect's brain. And that information decoded in the insect's brain, and the insect knows, okay, there's food over there. I should go check it out. So, that's a communication system. Through Claude Shannon's model. And we normally don't, he wasn't thinking about biology when he put this together, and normally engineers don't think about biology when they're looking at this chart. But signaling it's kind of difficult for humans to really understand. Like the concepts I'm going to be talking about today take a while to grasp. And the reason for that is that we are swimming in symbols and signaling. This is Morse code, and if you look at this chart, Morse code is these sounds, deet dot, deet 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 dot, and you can send them over a wire, and they represent letters. And so we're used to looking at things like this, charts like this. But if you look at this, we actually have symbols that represent other symbols that represent other symbols. So these dots and dashes here represent A. be, the letters of the alphabet. But those letters of the alphabet also represent symbols. They represent sounds of words, and words themselves are symbols that represent actual thoughts in our heads. So it's a crazy. We are just swimming in symbols. Our species, we think in symbols. Our brains work by letting us think in symbols. Most of us think in words, right? In words and images. And those words they're just symbols. So because of this, it almost becomes difficult to talk about symbols that end up evolving in nature, because it's like seeing the air that we're breathing. It's difficult for us, but just keep that in mind. This is difficult, but it's not impossible. You just have to be careful and really think about these things carefully. So anything in nature can be used as a symbol in a communication system. There can be tactile signals, visual signals, chemical signals, and audible signals. This dog is sending signals to other dogs. He's not just relieving himself, he's peeing as high as he can on this it looks like a palm tree there, so that he can, announce his presence to other dogs in the area, and they will come sniff that, and they're going to get information about who's there. So this is actually a communication system that has evolved from dog urine, and I find that hilarious. Here's, again, we talked about flowers, and that these colors are signals. They are symbols in a communication system. So these are visual symbols. These insects are using chemical symbols to communicate to each other. They're actually rubbing their antenna across each other, and they're getting information about, who are you? Are you a member of my group? Are you not? And they're communicating there just through chemicals. And of course, there's tactile symbols. There's all sorts of gestures that animals have that they there's gestures that can be seen, and there's physical connection here. We have one chimp grooming another chimp, and that is both functional, as in they're getting groomed, right? But it's also a symbol of friendship and closeness that these animals are sharing with each other. So all sorts of different symbols that can pop up in biology, and biology is filled with communication systems, layers and layers of communication systems. Your body tissues signal to each other with hormones. It's fascinating how deep this goes. So signaling happens between members of the same species. This is a butterfly fish, and butterfly fish, it's really interesting. They have very species specific colorations. Oh, thank you. I got a super chat from Canadian Allison. Appreciate that. Super chats are welcome, by the way. And so these butterfly fish, they're actually signaling to each other that, hey, I'm a member of your species. And there's several reasons why that's important, that they know that there's a member of their species around. One of which is that they tend to have extremely specific diets. And if there's more than one individual of the same species on one little patch of the coral reef, likely it's going to be hard to find food there. So they're actually kind of warning each other, hey, I'm already here, don't come here. I might have to chase you off if you do come here, because this is my little patch of the woods. And they also, of course, signal during mating time, like, hey, I'm a member of your species, let's mate. So there's lots of different reasons for that. Peacocks are signaling. This is signaling between sexes. This peacock is saying, look how healthy I am. I'm so healthy that I can maintain this obnoxiously bright-colored, hard-to-maintain tail. Not only can I survive, I can maintain this extravagant, just flamboyant tail. So you should probably mate with me. I've got good genes. And signaling happens between predator and prey. This is a springbok antelope, and it's doing what's called stotting. There's other words for it as well, but they do this when they're running in a herd. the herd runs slower than an individual can run, obviously, because there's just a little bit of chaos in that herd. So when they're being chased by a predator, they will jump straight up in the air like this, and that shows the predator, yeah, I'm running kind of slow right now, but as soon as you single me out, I will smoke you. I am powerful. Don't mess with me. So they can jump vertically to show the predator how strong they are, and the predators know what this means. They're like, wow, I'm not going to mess with that guy, and they're going to look for one that can't really do this very well, and they're going to try and single out that one because they're going to have a better chance of catching it. So basically, what this signal is saying, what this is a symbol saying, don't eat me, eat that other guy. I'm not good. You're not going to catch me. This is a really interesting group of signals that are happening here. This is a goby and his shrimp companion. So signaling happens between mutualistic symbionts. These two organisms live in symbiosis. The shrimp digs a burrow, and the goby lives in that burrow, and the goby takes the shrimp out on little hunting expeditions or food gathering expeditions. The shrimp has poor eyesight, and it will touch the goby's tail with its antenna, and it can kind of taste the goby. It knows that, oh, you're my goby, you're my buddy, with those antennae, and it can feel all sorts of movements. And so there develops between these two individuals that there will develop a relationship between them, a communication system between them, where they can signal to each other all sorts of things. They'll signal danger and all sorts of other things to each other, and it's really fascinating. You should go on get on YouTube and look this up. It's really cool to watch these companions interact with each other. So languages that develop between organisms, they vary in complexity from one signal, one word, to many. So this poison dart frog is advertising that it's poisonous, saying don't eat me, you will die, or you will get sick at least if you try and eat me. And that's a one word communication system. That's it. And it's a lot of different predators understand that word, and they stay away. The bee here and the flower has many signals in its language that it has with the bee. It can signal when there is pollen with different fragrances. It will send out different signals. After it's been pollinated, it will send out a smell saying shops closing. It'll stop producing nectar. It'll send out a specific smell, and many species that will change color fairly rapidly after they've been pollinated and they no longer need pollen. Thanks for the super chat there. Moataz Magdi. Oh, this is a signal of appreciation to one of the best Evo channels on YouTube. Thanks. I appreciate that. So these languages can really vary in complexity, and from one word to many words. Now, in computers, you have an encoding, decoding rules. Those rules are set up in advance. So the encoder and the decoder have the same rules for encoding and decoding, and those rules are known by the encoder and the decoder. So in my computer, my keyboard, it sends out zeros and ones that my computer then decodes into zeros and ones or into letters that show up on my computer screen, and those rules are set up in advance. And so it becomes confusing when you try and think about how on earth could this evolve, because these things have to be set up in advance. What the heck is going on here? Like, how could something this complex, how could a communication system evolve naturally? Gaurav Sharma, thank you for the super chat as well. I appreciate that. So this is how we get. This is kind of a mystery, right? For evolutionary biologists, they've not been thinking about this typically from communication or from information theory perspective, but this has been perplexing biologists for a long time, and it's because of this that signaling theory was developed. And so this is the big question that I want to answer today: is how do communication systems evolve? And before I dig in there, I just wanted to look to see if anyone has any questions here. It looks like I just got one from Akisai channel. How can signaling types change microorganisms use chemical and some use visual signaling, but these signals are simple. But how can multicellular signaling methods change so vastly? So, well, if we go to this model here of communication, the whole point of encoding information is to transmit it in some way. So my keyboard needs to transmit information from my fingers to my computer, and it does that through zeros and ones. Technically, it does that through, voltage differences. It sends out series of charges to the computer that the computer interprets as zeros and ones, and then translates that into letters. So the whole point is to transmit information, and at whatever scale you happen to be. So the flower is the plant is this big thing living in the environment. Color is a really good way to transmit information through the air, through across long distances. And color is also something that actually can evolve quite easily. Color is actually a result of pigments. So, and those pigments are just molecules inside the cell. So it actually is really, it is chemical signaling, you could say, but it's chemical signaling inside the tissue of a plant that changes the plant's color, and that acts as a signal that can be transmitted through long distances to an insect that can see it from quite a ways away. Birds and other things that can see those. So this is it really is. If you really look at it closely in biology, these signals are all they're really all chemical. When you get down to it, they really are all chemical, and it's very similar to the simple chemical signals that we see bacteria using to communicate with each other. It's just that they end up manifesting in different ways. The signals that I'm using right now, the symbols, the words that I'm using right now, are also really, if you really get down to it, they are chemical. The muscles that are being used to form these words are being controlled by chemical signals in my nervous system and chemical electrical signals in my nervous system. And of course, the chemistry happening in the muscles in my throat. So all of that really is chemical. It's the same sorts of things that we see microorganisms using. So yeah, it's weird how these things have evolved. They are quite spectacular. Another question I got from Canadian Ellison. Do we know what the origin of certain signals are, like red being a color visual for danger, poison? Must have very ancient evolutionary basis, right? Because it's so, and ... it's so common. Yeah, I will talk about that a little bit later in this presentation, actually. The color red, well, yeah, we'll talk about that. How these things emerge is interesting. And once something becomes dominant, so it actually could be anything. Anything can be used as a symbol in a communication system. But once when we're talking about signaling between predator and prey, when a prey item happens to be dangerous and it can warn a potential predator, hey, I'm actually more dangerous than you think. Once something sticks, it could be anything. It could be a smell, it could be a color, it could be any color. But once something sticks, once something has got started, new predators who come onto the scene will end up evolving to understand that, because it's that signal will become stronger and stronger and stronger, and then new predators who are exposed to this danger and are looking for, when you eat something nasty and you get sick, you pay attention to what it was that you just ate, and you do not want to eat that again. And so if the thing you just ate had these bright red spots on it, well, now you're going to avoid things with bright red spots on them. So that's how this works, really. It's other things either learn or evolve, because you can actually evolve a phobia of red spots over evolutionary time, or you can learn it with a brain. So you can learn signals, or you can evolve to understand them. And again, you don't even need a brain to understand them. Flowers can understand, they actually get signals from insects as well, and they interpret those, and they respond to those without a brain. So it's not that red, there's nothing about red that's in general that says danger. It's that red has evolved to become a symbol of danger because of really an accident of evolutionary history. But now that it's so common, other organisms that are toxic, if they happen to have a little bit of red pigment in them, evolution will drive them to become more bright red because so many predators already understand that bright red is a danger. And you even have some organisms that are evolving warning signals when they aren't toxic. And actually, I probably shouldn't go into this because it could be a whole hour of talking about this. And there's a lot to cover in here today, but that is a very interesting rabbit hole to go down. And I might just do a whole lesson on that, on warning colors and their mimics some other time. There is a good talk by Nancy Miarelli about that, and I'll try and find that and link to it in the video description. Let's see. Have you investigated semiotics at all? I am not super familiar with that. No. So I'm gonna get back to the slides here, and if you write a question to me at stated space casually, I will try and answer that. I've got a couple of breaks during this presentation where I can answer questions. So, okay. So, how do communication systems evolve? Before we can really understand how they evolve between different organisms, it's good to ask the easier question: how do they develop between thinking animals? So this is my dog Zoe, and you've probably seen her on this channel before. She's been in a couple of videos, and yeah, she's my favorite. There she is with Monolo. She's so much my favorite that I put too many pictures of her in this slideshow here. Here's her begging for attention. And her and I have a fairly complex communication system, and that communication system has developed between us over time as we've lived together. And signals, the actual symbols, the words that exist in a communication system, they might not be words, they might be colors, they might be whatever. These signals, they start out as cues, and this is what biology, this is what we learn in biology. This is what comes from signaling theory. So this idea of cues and signals. Cues and signals are two very different things to a biologist. Zoe has developed a communication system with me when she's thirsty, when she's out of water, and this started out as a cue. What would happen is when she would run out of water in her dog bowl, she would go into the bathroom and she would lick water off the bathtub from whoever last took a shower. And the setup of my house, my office is right next to the bathroom. And so I can hear her little toenails when she's in the bathroom and when she jumps into the bathtub and starts licking the water. So I would get up, I am a cue detector. I would detect that cue, like, oh, crap, Zoe's thirsty. And I would get up and I would go fill her water bowl. There she is, waiting for water as I'm filling it. And so I was a cue detector, and when I detected that cue, I changed my behavior. And it just so happened that my change of behavior was something that she liked. It benefited her. And so what she did, she realized that I was detecting a cue. And after realizing that I was detecting a cue and that she liked how I responded when I detected this cue, she started doing something else. She started doing something easier. When she was thirsty, when she ran out of water, because of my negligence, I just forget to fill up her water bowl in the morning, she would go to the shower and she would put her claws on it and she would make noise. And this is what she does now. She'll go and she'll just rub her claws. She'll bang her claws against the bathtub. And I will hear that, and I'll go running out, and I'll go get her water. So this is a signal. This is an active transmission. So she went from a passive transmission of just going and drinking water. That was just something that she was doing. She was not at all trying to communicate with me. That's a passive cue. She went from transmitting a passive cue that she was thirsty to transmitting an active signal that she is thirsty. And now we have a new word in our communication system that she's developed with me. And we have all sorts of things that, I mean, she's, I live in Canada, I live in Montreal, and it's funny because my dogs, they actually understand more French than I do. Because Marilyn she speaks French, and she mostly trains our dogs in French, and I train them in English, and so they're bilingual. So, yeah, there's Zoe. Canadian Allison. Holy crap, Zoe is adorable, and thank you for answering my question. I believe I had the flow of cause and effect jumbled in my mind. Yeah. So, Zoe is amazing, but this is not exclusive to dogs. This is not exclusive to even humans. But, this happens between pretty much all thinking animals. So when two organisms with thinking brains are motivated to cooperate, they can transform cues into signals, and that helps them cooperate in whatever way they're going to cooperate in the wild. And you'll see all sorts of these signaling systems develop between animals with thinking brains, and it's beautiful. Here's kind of an equation for this. So a cue, which is passive, becomes a signal, which is active transmission. So passive transmission, then active transmission. And this, ends up resulting in a communication system. And there might be just one word, one symbol in that communication system, or there might be many symbols in that communication system. It depends on how long the relationship lasts and how intense that relationship is, how much cooperation there is. So again, when two or more organisms, I'm getting repetitive. So humans need not apply. Signaling can occur between different organisms. Here's a coyote and a badger that have joined forces to hunt together. And here we see this coyote. He's like, come on, let's go. Let's go hunt. He's telling this badger that it's time. And he's like, okay, I'm coming. And, people get mad when you kind of personify animals like this, anthropomorphize, but this really is communication. This is the coyote and the badger. They are signaling to each other. This is not an illusion. This is real communication happening. And this happens between all sorts of different species, birds and everything. I used to work at I used to volunteer at a wildlife rehab center, and we would train birds. And you can train a bird through a very simple process of, you give it food. And so when it realizes that it's cooperating with you, I need to do this thing for the audience, and then I get this food, this treat that I love most. The bird learns how to do that. And as an animal trainer, you learn how to speed this process up. But it's very, very common all throughout the animal world to learn and to develop communication systems, between other members of your own species and between members of other species. Happens all the time. So in computers, the encoding and decoding rules of a communication system, they have to be set up in advance, or they don't have to be, but they are set up in advance. There actually are cases of things evolving over time. Now that we have AI, different AI systems can end up developing their own languages between each other as well. But for the most part, the encoding and decoding systems in a computer are set up in advance. But in thinking animals, the encoding and decoding rules of a communication system, they can develop over time. They do develop over time. It's just, if there is incentive to cooperate, cues become signals and a communication system emerges. This is completely natural if you have a thinking mind and you are cooperating with another organism that has a thinking mind. Here's another example. When I was in Boy Scouts as a kid, we had bears in our region, and they were actually black bears. I have a grizzly bear here. I was in Oregon, and we don't have so many grizzly bears there, but we do have black bears. They're very common. And bears do not, unless they're starving, they do not want to encounter a human. Humans are dangerous. Humans are unpredictable. Bears have just kind of learned, don't mess with those guys unless you're really hungry and you're really desperate. They're not an easy kill in general. And so bears want to avoid you. But if you startle a bear by just walking up on it, it will defend itself and it'll get in a fight with you, and it can get injured, and you can get injured, and it's no good for anyone. And so the bear is listening for cues of people. It's listening for footsteps in the woods and so on. We were told that we should magnify that and walk loudly when we're in bear territory. We should talk with each other loudly, and you can actually buy bells that you can wear and you can put on your backpack for warning bears that you are in their area. And bears respond to this. Of course, there are some instances where, if you're in an area where people use cowbells, well, cowbells are ringing for dinner if you're a bear. So you don't want to wear a bear bell in a territory where people are also using cowbells. But anyway, you're sending out the wrong signal, right? There can be signal misinterpretation there. But in general, these bear bells there's actually mixed results from studies as to whether or not these work well. But we do know that if you're talking loudly as you're walking through the woods and making a lot of noise, bears tend to pick up on that and they get out of the way. They avoid you. So that is an example of a cue, which is just your sound, becoming a signal when you magnify that sound. When you actively transmit sound, you have gone from a cue sender to a signal sender, and you are doing that for the bear's sake. Well, for your sake and the bear's sake. So again, cue is passive transmission. I'm really hammering this down because it's hard to get. A cue is a passive transmission. So here, someone has gone to the toilet and they've left the seat up, which is a cue that a man was there using and peeing while standing up. And then you have a signal, which is active transmission. This dog is really trying to make it known that he peed right there. And that's very different. You have a passive transmission. It's actually easier to leave the seat up than to put it back down afterwards. So this is a passive transmission. And then you have active transmission. This dog is really, putting in some effort here to aim as high as possible to let others know that he exists. So again, that's how this is an example of a signal that exists in a thinking animal. But how do signals evolve? Here, a flower has evolved these bright colors to attract a pollinator, and the insect understands that signal, and it has come here for nectar, and it is going to collect pollen and pollinate other flowers. Not really intentionally, it's going to do that, just because it's going from flower to flower, but that is the consequence of feeding, is pollination. So, super, super interesting. How did this evolve? And I've got a bunch of examples of flowers here. These are, some of these are from Oregon. So this one here is from Ecuador. I do a tour of Ecuador every year. I used to. I don't know if we're going to be able to do those again with COVID. This is from Oregon. These beautiful flowers here growing in the clovers here. This is from my buddy Jeremiah, his backyard. This is in Ecuador, up on the top of a mountain here. Beautiful flower there. California. Ecuador. This is in their botanical gardens, and these are all different signals that have evolved to attract different specific species of insect, and in some cases birds, to pollinate. And these are all flowering plants. They are angiosperms, and the flower of the plant is, of course, its sex organ, and it's attracting plants because it wants them to help it have sex with other plants. And the insects are an intermediate. They bring the pollen from one plant to another. And I'm sure that's all elementary review for this audience, but I have this meme that you may have seen on Twitter. As a token of my affection, please accept this bouquet of severed angiosperm genitals. I find it very funny that this is what we do when we're in love, we give each other sex organs, severed sex organs of another species to show our affection to one another. It's super strange ritual that we do. That's how we signal to each other, which is disturbing. But anyway, so flowers, they exist, and it's a mystery. How the heck did this evolve? If we look at non-flowering plants, this is a gymnosperm. Gymnosperms, they don't develop these complex flowers with these beautiful signals that are transmitted through the air. Instead, for the most part, gymnosperms, they just spit out pollen into the wind, and that wind will sort of, sometimes bring that pollen to another plant and pollinate that plant. And this is very ineffective, right? You have to make a lot of pollen, and that pollen could go anywhere. It's really rare for it to actually hit its target, even when a lot of pollen is produced. And so, the flowering plants, they're doing a similar thing, but way more specific. That bug, that insect, that butterfly, that bee, it goes to one flower on one plant, and then it immediately flies directly to another plant, covered in pollen. It climbs around on that plant, and it pollinates that plant. So this is way more efficient, right? The efficiency difference here is insane. And what a beautiful advantage that is. And we think that this evolved from something like a gymnosperm. It originated in a plant sort of like this. And the big clue for this is that some gymnosperms actually do have insects that can help in the pollination process. So here we have beetles. These beetles, they detect the cues, the cone shape, from quite a long distance, and they go there and they actually live inside these cones. They eat pollen. So they are pollen predators. And if you have a pollen predator, any mutation that makes pollen stick to that predator on part of its body that it can't easily clean off, any mutation that will allow that to happen is going to aid in pollination, because you're being attacked by a predator and it's devastating to you. Your pollen that's so hard to produce is being eaten, but it's also sticking to the predator. And when that predator goes to another cone, that is going to be transmitted. There's a chance that pollen will be transmitted and fertilization will take place. So any mutation that causes your pollen to stick better to that predator is going to help you pollinate another plant. So that is going to benefit you. And there's going to be a point in your evolution as this happens. If this interaction continues long enough, there will be a point where the predator is actually more of a help than a danger to you, because of the fact that it pollinates other cones. So here we have, once pollen predators become more helpful than damaging, any mutation that magnifies the cue that you exist, that you have a cone, that helps the predator find a cone, will be beneficial. So anything that magnifies a cue will be beneficial. And what is a magnified cue? A magnified cue is a signal. And we have found that in these I always forget how to pronounce their names. I've had people explain this to me many times. I think it's cycad, the cycad plant. We have found that cycad plants, they emit this really nasty odor during their mating season. And it's funny because the cycad plants are beautiful. People have them in their homes. People have them in landscaping. But when it becomes mating season for this plant, they start to emit this really nasty odor that people hate. You got to put your plant outside. You avoid walking in that area of your yard because it just stinks so bad. And they are actively transmitting signals to beetles. And this relationship between cycads and beetles has existed for over 100 million years. We don't know if they're actively transmitting signals this early, but we have found that beetles, they have been fossilized with pollen that resembles cycad pollen on them. See, I've pronounced it like 5 different ways now. Cycad. I'm just going to stick with that. Cycad plants. So these beetles have the pollen on them in fossils that are over almost 100 million years old. So the relationship has been happening for a long time. We don't know how long the active signaling has been taking place, but today there is very active signaling by this plant. It really transmits an odor, and it does other things. It'll actually drive them away with certain odors, and it'll attract them with certain odors. So once they've been collecting pollen for a while, it ramps up that odor, and it actually increases the temperature of the cone, and it drives the beetles out, and then they go find another cone. And so it's actually a very complex signaling system that exists today between these specific beetles and this specific group of plants. So it's a really complex system that's evolved here, and it's different than the signaling system that evolved in flowering plants. So we see that this benefit, it's when there's a benefit to the plant that a signaling system will develop, and it develops gradually. It appears to develop gradually. Cues become signals. So, cue, any passive transmission a sender makes that can be detected by another organism. Signal, any transmission actively magnified by a sender because its reception by a receiver helps the sender better survive and reproduce. So, over evolutionary time, this happens in a very similar way, just the same way that it happens between thinking organisms that are cooperating. When there is selection pressure, evolutionary selection pressure to cooperate, signals evolve from cues. This happens as long as the relationship is existing long enough. Signals will evolve naturally. So they can develop between thinking organisms, or they can evolve between two evolving entities under selection pressure to cooperate. Here we have warning colors. And again, I could do a whole lesson on this, but these start because predators they just didn't like what they just ate or what they just killed, and they're looking for something about that organism that was that they can remember to look for in the future. So if they ate a frog that had a little bit of red on it, and like normally I love the frogs that I eat, but this one made me sick. What was different about it? It had a little bit of a red tint to it. Well, then they're going to start looking for red, and then that produces an evolutionary pressure. If enough of these predators are looking for red to avoid red, that produces an evolutionary pressure for the frog to become more red, and eventually there's going to be a point where camouflage is less important than being red, and then that red can become a symbol of toxicity. And as we see here with these butterflies are also extremely toxic, and they are signaling that they are toxic with the blue and the orange, and that has evolved independently, and it's a different color. So it's not that the color is important, it's that it can be recognized by a predator. That's what's important. And these relationships, these signals evolve very slowly. But once they become strong, other organisms can figure out what they mean just by interacting with these animals. So it evolves slowly. It can evolve from anything. Again, humans are good at picking up on colors. We can't pick up so well on smells, but animals and plants are emitting all sorts of scents that they're signaling with smells as well. They're signaling with all sorts of things. Anything can become a symbol in a communication system. Here we have a mimic. This is a non-venomous snake mimicking a venomous snake by pretending to have venom glands. It puffs up the sides of its head, and birds of prey think that is a venomous snake, and so they're reluctant to eat it. They don't want to get bit, and that works really well. Can signals backfire, like attracting locusts instead of pollinators? Asks Gaurav Sharma. Yes, they can. This happens quite a bit. When a predator from a different environment comes to a new environment, a lot of these signals are misinterpreted, and they can go and hunt the thing. It's usually bad for both of them, right? Because the predator will get poisoned and sometimes die, and the prey item will die also because it got eaten. So yeah, it definitely backfires. It backfires a lot. Also, if a male is trying to communicate with a female of his own species by making some sort of a bird call, whatever, a predator can pick up on that and hunt the animal. So it's really fun. Go out into a pond at night when frogs are calling, and you'll hear them get quiet around you because they're trying to signal to their mates like, hey, look at me, I'm ready to mate. But they don't want to accidentally signal to a predator, hey, look at me, I'm ready to eat. And so they're very cautious as they're signaling. And these butterflies that I showed you in the opening slide, the blue butterflies, they can actually hide their coloration. They're bright blue on one side of the wing and like a brownish black on the other side. So they fold up their wings and hide that when predators are around, and then they open it up and flash it when they're trying to communicate with their partners. So you have the evolution of symbols and oftentimes the ability to hide that symbol because it can backfire. So yeah, that happens a lot. That's a good question. This is really interesting. This is a red deer, and this comes right from the textbook, from Stewart's textbook. He does have color photos in there as well, but this is a couple of photos from an old paper these are photos taken in black and white, kind of less high quality than I usually like to put in my slides. But these deer, they will howl at each other or growl in mating season. What happens is the males fight for dominance, and then the females mate with the most dominant male. And so this top guy, he's howling, he's growling. There's different things that people call it, but he's signaling how big he is. And this is what we call it's a specific type of signal called oh gosh, I'm forgetting the name of it. It's an index. There we go. It's an index of his size. So, sorry, my voice is really struggling this morning. He growls, and the depth of the sound made by that growl is a direct correlation of how big he is. And so he's warning to other males, hey, don't mess with me, I'm huge. And that makes them stay away. The second part of a fight, the male, when growls are matched, the males will come up to each other and they'll size each other up visually. And if they can't figure out who's bigger after doing that, then they'll fight. So the fight is a last resort. And the same thing happens with humans, by the way. We size each other up like crazy before we actually get into a fight. Just go to a bar and watch this happen in real time. Well, I guess you can't really watch this happen so much now that we're all in lockdown from COVID, but as soon as bars open up in your area and there's not risk of a disease, go and try and watch a bar fight. It's amusing to watch people size each other up. But actually, an actual fight hardly ever happens. It usually just people size each other up, and then they realize who's stronger and they back down. But this happens in animals as well, and they have this complex signaling system, and humans have a complex signaling system as well, and it's not one that we're very much aware of. We size each other up without really knowing consciously what's happening. We have an evolved signaling system between fighting males that exists even in humans. It's really interesting. But the funniest thing about these red deer is we know by looking at their anatomy, this is an honest signal of size, these growls are, but we know from their evolutionary history by looking at their anatomy that there was a point in their history where they were lying to each other because the voice box has moved back to the chest. It's expanded and fills up the entire neck and goes down into the chest. And what was happening is it was easier to lie about how big you were. Evolution was pulling the voice box to change in size to lie about how big they were. And they could actually bluff and get away with it sometimes and avoid a fight by lying. And that there was an evolutionary arms race for lying about how big you are. And so they have this really exaggerated voice box. and it's to the point to where it can't be exaggerated anymore. The actual neck would have to grow to exaggerate this now. And if you grow your neck out longer, that makes your antlers, that makes your neck weaker during a fight. So there's an evolutionary pressure to keep your neck, at a certain size. And so now the signal is honest again. They cannot fake their size through a growl. But it's really funny that you can see that in their evolutionary past, they were liars. They were lying for a time there. And this is most exaggerated in the, this is a hammerhead bat. Their voice box goes all through their body. It's like halfway through their chest, all the way down to the diaphragm. So they have maxed this out. They also signal their size through a type of growl in their voice box. And yeah, so they're the most extreme liars in the animal kingdom when it comes to trying to tell each other how big you are. Canadian Allison, she says, we call it hold me back fighting in my region. Yeah. The hold me back fighting is very common in a bar. Of course, there are reasons aside from being scared of the size of your opponent. In humans, it's also illegal to fight in most areas, and this is true in most animals. Animals do not want to fight. They will avoid it at all costs, and so they do these signaling contests before a fight. Even predator and prey, things will make themselves look bigger than they are. They do all sorts of things to try and bluff how big they are, and that happens in nature and it happens in humans. Here's a really cool example of dishonest signaling. This flower is sending out pheromones. So they send out all sorts of chemical signals, right? They're transmitting all sorts of signals. And somehow, during the evolutionary history of this flower, of this plant, one of its molecules it was sending out happened to be similar to the sex hormone of a bee. And that made males come to this flower thinking it was a female, and they would check it out and sometimes try and mate with it. And that helped in pollination. Having this bee climb all over you, doesn't matter if it's collecting nectar or what it's doing, doesn't matter. As long as it's climbing all over you, you're benefiting because it's going to get pollen stuck to it and it's going to go to another flower and pollinate that one. And so this thing has actually specialized. It no longer produces nectar. Nectar is a bribe to get insects to pollinate them. It no longer produces nectar. It just specializes in one hormone, one sex hormone. And this fur here is tactile. It kind of feels the way the hairs on a female bee feel. And so all of this causes the bee to stay longer and copulate with this flower. Here's a bee actually copulating with the flower, and it's got pollen stuck to it. That yellow thing on its butt there, that's a pollen packet specially adapted to this one species of bee. That this flower, it's lying. It's saying, I'm a female bee. Come mate with me. And apparently, this is not really hurting the bee because this relationship has been maintained for a long time. Maybe it's actually even good practice for the bee. They found that bees that have actually copulated with a real female, they're less likely to get tricked by this, but new bees will get tricked into this until they meet a real female, and then they tend to figure it out. But this is hilarious. Plants are lying to insects, and it's good for them. They no longer have to spend so much energy producing nectar. So anyway, I've got a little bit of time here, again, for questions before I jump into the final segment here. So I think it should be clear at this point that cues can become signals in a communication system. And it doesn't matter if this happens through evolution or through animals figuring this out with their brains. It can happen either way. Plants can do it. I haven't really talked about it here, but bacteria signal to each other through chemicals. Your tissues in your body signal to each other. And, this is they do this through hormones. And we're going to learn that chains of RNA and DNA, they send out signals to ribosomes in your body. So communication happens all the way down in biology. Biology is layers of communication. So I'm going to got a couple of questions here. When was the first signaling system? Asked by Aki Sci Channel. That we are going to talk about. We actually don't know when the very first signaling evolved, because it's probably long gone by now. But the oldest signaling system that exists is the genetic system, which is chains of RNA sending signals to the ribosome. And those signals, it's telling the ribosome how to build specific proteins. So there is the oldest existing signaling system that we see in biology is the genetic code. That is a communication system that exists between evolving molecules. So chains of RNA can actually evolve. In the laboratory, we know that chains of RNA can evolve on their own, and they can adapt to their environment. They need an enzyme that can help them replicate. So this is not something, the model of RNA evolving independently doesn't yet work in a prebiotic environment. So we're trying to figure out how RNA or something similar to RNA would have evolved without enzymes and things that these modern biomolecules that exist today. That is the big question in evolutionary and origin of life chemistry, is how do we get an evolving system without enzymes? But RNA is a molecule that can evolve without, it evolves on its own if you give it an enzyme to let it reproduce. And the genetic code appears to be a communication system that evolved between different chains of RNA, because the ribosome, which is what builds proteins, it's actually made of RNA. Its core that does the protein building, that is an RNA core. And the messenger RNA, which tells the ribosome how to build proteins, that is a piece of RNA as well. And so this is an evolved communication system between two evolving entities under selection pressure to cooperate. And this communication system is maintained by these two evolving entities, the ribosome and the nucleus of the cell in eukaryotes, but really just messenger RNAs. This communication system is maintained through evolutionary pressures to cooperate to build protein, and we think that it actually evolved under selection pressure to build protein. So that is the oldest version, and actually the rest of my slides actually talk about that in more detail. Tim Smith, I think cephalopods are the best at signaling. What do you think? Well, cephalopods, or I guess humans, cephalopods can signal through flashes of color in their skin. And cephalopods, dolphins, they can communicate. Cephalopods might be communicating a lot more information per second than humans can because of the way that they signal. They flash these complex groups of light and dark on their skin to signal to each other. They might be signaling a lot more information than we are per second. And dolphins might be doing the same. Dolphins, there is reason to believe that dolphins can project a three-dimensional image from one individual to another with a chirp, because they see with radar. They have this their visual system is highly activated through their auditory system. They can actually see images with radar. And because they can see with sound, we think that they can mimic sounds that give each other three-dimensional images. And we think this because of a series of experiments that were done where they'd show an animal, one dolphin, a three-dimensional image, and that dolphin had to communicate that image to another dolphin to get a treat. And we think from those experiments that they are able to do this. Through sounds, they can communicate three-dimensional images to each other, which is super cool. But yeah, there's a lot of signaling happening in nature. All kinds. Let's see, did I miss a question here? Gaurav Sharma asks, are there examples of communication systems having to adapt because human interference, like ship noise disrupting whale sounds maybe? Yes. actually many signaling systems have adapted, had to change because of human interaction. The one that I know of, that the actual study that I can tell you of, is on frogs in Oregon, and I actually helped on this research. I've filmed a bunch of it, and I need to put it together and make a video. I've been meaning to do this for years. It was like 6 years ago that I filmed this, and it's like, yeah. But we went out and I only helped a couple of nights, but we would listen to frogs signaling in ponds that are really far away from freeways and ponds that are right next to freeways. We measured the differences in sounds, and they were quite dramatic. They've changed the frequency of their call to adapt to car noises that rumble in the range of their call. And so they actually sound differently. And this is just individual real-time adaptation, we think. We don't think there's evolution happening there. We don't think the voice box has changed. But I suppose if this were to happen long enough, you would actually see an anatomical difference in populations near freeways versus far away from freeways. That could probably happen. But it's, yeah, we do see this all the time. Organisms adapt their signaling strategies because of human interference. That's a good question. I don't know why I have a black screen on. Here's my face. Hi. That's better than a black screen, right? Hopefully. Let's see here. Dolphins also have names or signature whistles for each other. Yeah, I've heard that as well. Squids communicate with a secret skin power alphabet. Not yet, but I will now. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, so there is, we have not decoded, we don't know, we don't understand, so far as I know, maybe we do, but I don't think we understand the communication systems that exist between cephalopods. I think that they're still mysterious to us. We just know that the communication is happening. It takes us a lot of time to figure out how different organisms are communicating with each other. It's very complicated. We just recently learned that butterfly fish are actually telling each other, hey, I'm a member of your species, don't come here because I'm eating the thing that you want to eat, and I'll have to fight you. That, like, figuring out that signaling system that exists between butterfly fish, that was super recent. And yeah, pretty much anything that you look at that's weird, that makes no sense, like, why is this animal colored this way? It's because it's signaling to another member of its species, or it's because it's signaling to a predator. I mean, you don't want to over apply a theory, but in general, that's what's happened. Every time we've looked into one of these really weird traits, it turns out to be a signaling system. It's communication. So that is super, super common that ends up being the case. Do you know of any other uses of symbols other than the human writing system? Yeah, everything I've been talking about here, these are symbols. So the color of a flower is a symbol. That has nothing to do with whether or not it's got pollen, right? The color of a flower is a symbol that is being transmitted to an insect. In the case of the growl of a red deer, that's an index. You wouldn't call it a symbol, you call it an index, because it's just showing how big the animal is. And it's an honest index. The flower color is a legitimate symbol. It has nothing to do with, there's no direct correlation between, in physics, there's no direct correlation between the color of a petal and how much pollen there is. That is an evolved symbol that the flower has developed and the insect has developed. It's a symbol that's evolved between these two entities. It's an abstract symbol. And this is what we see, the hormones that are transmitted from one part of your body tissue to another part. Again, there's nothing about testosterone, for example, that makes cells grow in a masculine manner. It's because there is a receptor that's evolved to receive testosterone, and then that, through a series of chemical reactions that have evolved in the cell, enzymes that have evolved, causes the cell to change its behavior when it receives testosterone. There's nothing in physics that dictates this. this communication system has evolved between tissues in your body. Let's see. Has evolution given us such intelligence that we can understand genetics and manipulate it? Won't it be good to modify ourselves as we desire? I guess you're asking, did this evolve so that, did our intelligence evolve so we could eventually manipulate genetics? No. Evolution does not have foresight. So the fact that we just figured out genetics is really circumstantial. It's not understood why we evolved to be so smart, but it's also often misunderstood how smart we actually are. As individuals, we are not that intelligent. There are certain tests that chimps beat us on, like routinely. There are memory games that chimps will always beat humans on. What the secret to our success is our cooperation in groups and the ability now through writing to conserve information. We can pass down things that we've figured out from person to person, and parent to child through teaching, and from person to person by talking to each other. But other animals can talk to each other as well. Other animals can show each other things. You see monkeys that will teach each other how to open shells and so on. And that will be passed on from generation to generation. You see monkey cultures develop, monkey technologies develop. But we have this writing system. We have this really intricate, abstract communication system that we have developed through speaking. And this allows us to really ramp up what we can accumulate, the technologies we can accumulate. It happens that through that, we have developed the ability to edit genes. And this is nothing that evolution foresaw. Evolution doesn't foresee anything, and it's not a thinking thing. It's just a process. It's just descent with modification acted upon by selection. And it happens to have produced a species because it was beneficial that can cooperate with other members of its species. And that cooperation became so exaggerated that we can now manipulate our own genes. It's crazy to think about how this unfolded, but yeah, it's really an accident of circumstances that we can do this now. Just selection pressure was favoring communication and cooperation, and now we can modify genes in a lab, and that might not be good for us, actually. I would argue that it's probably the most dangerous thing we've learned how to do, because we can now manipulate, we can make bacteria, we can make weapons now that were unthinkable in the past, and we can make them for cheap. So I wouldn't say that genetic engineering is a good thing for our species. It might end up being a catastrophe. So not to worry everyone, but that really could be the end of our civilization, actually. Let's see. So non-living things can have a communication system. Computers, yeah. But communication systems like this, active communication systems, they do not emerge between non-living things. A signal, remember, in biology, is an active transmission of what used to be a cue, right? And that transition, so far as we know, you need evolution to cause that to happen. So evolving entities. Now, some people don't want to think that biomolecules are alive, but biomolecules are evolving entities, and so they can develop communication systems between each other. Bacteria can develop communication systems between each other, and so on through the process of evolution. But if you don't have something that's evolving, if you don't have two evolving entities, descent with modification acted upon by natural selection, then so far as we know, there's not another way for a communication system to develop where you actually have active transmission and encoding and decoding that actually happens actively. Evolution is one way that can happen, and a thinking mind inventing a system is the other way that it can happen. And we don't know of an alternative. Let's see. if we can teach chimps sign language, can't they teach others? Yes, that actually happens a little bit. But the sign language, chimps don't seem to be able to use language in the same way, with the same complexity that humans do. There's something very special about the human mind and the way that we use language that chimps don't get. They don't get far past, adding 2 or 3 words together to make a sentence when they use sign language. And they're actually using grunts and other gestures that are so subtle that it's hard for us to understand. They were using them before they learned sign language, before people started teaching them signs. They were already doing this with each other. We just didn't understand it. So it's funny because like dogs are better at learning human signals than humans are at learning dog signals, right? And the same seems to be true with chimps. Like they pick up on our language better than we pick up on theirs. But they will teach each other signs, and they will develop signs on their own. One of the chimps at the, I think it's the Portland Zoo. It might be the Knoxville Zoo. I worked at both of them, and I can't remember where it was that we had a chimp that developed her own sign for humans, and it was this. She would do this with her hand, and it was, we humans have this bubble head. That's what we think she was doing. She's signing. Oh, they had the big ugly forehead, and I was there being trained. I was a volunteer there. I was there being trained. We were there after hours, and we went to the chimp area, and the chimp was signing to her trainer, so another human. She was signing to a trainer, and the trainer told us that she was doing this, and she was pointing at us and doing this, and she seemed really angry. And the trainer told us later that she was angry because humans were there after hours. It was supposed to be her time off, where she didn't have to get looked at by people. She did not like people, but she kind of understood that during the day she has to let people look at her. But when the zoo is closed, it's just her and her trainer and the other chimps. And so she was upset that people were looking at her. So I thought that was interesting on many levels. Like, first of all, a chimpanzee understands that she's got a shift. She has to work a shift. And yeah, it's just amazing. Like this chimp developed this communication with her trainer. She has her own symbol that she developed, and she's mad that we're there after hours. It was hilarious. Okay. Does our gut microbiome signal our brains to eat certain foods? I have heard that is happening. I don't know the details, but if so, that is going to be chemical signaling to the tissue of the stomach, which is somehow interpreted by the brain to feed that microbiome. So yeah, I have heard that happens, and I've heard that certain microbes can manipulate that, but I do not know. I haven't read the papers. I don't know the research. Can communication systems overlap, meaning the same communication system used by different species? Absolutely. Well, the genetic code is the universal communication system. All of us use almost the same genetic code. But let's see. Can I think of any other examples? Well, a lot of flowers can communicate with multiple species at once, because different pollinators have learned with their brains what that color means and what that fragrance means. And then multiple species have evolved to be attracted to the same colors and the same fragrances. So the flower will be interpreted by multiple species. So one signal will be understood by many. And yeah, that happens quite often. All mammals use pretty much the same hormones. So you can take a testosterone from one animal and put it into another. I think you can do that and without getting an immune response. There might be issues if the animals are too distantly related where that could be a problem, but I believe we actually get the testosterone you get from the doctor is produced by, I think it's like a ungulate. I can't remember. I don't remember what animal produces our testosterone. It actually might be a genetically modified bacteria to actually produce human testosterone, but I don't recall. But yeah, the communication systems are, if they share a common ancestor, they're going to still be using the same symbols in their communication system. So that does happen. Thank you, Allison. Okay, Honestly, this talk has been an antidepressant this morning. Pandemics are hard, and so education is that much more valuable during this time. Thank you. Well, I'm happy to help. Can some organisms convey messages as complex as neuron can without having neural network? A single neuron is actually transmitting pretty simple signals. It's an on or off. It's a yes or no signal. So yeah, to the next neuron. It's consciousness is it's still a mystery, but we think that consciousness emerges from lots of neurons talking to each other. We think. I mean, who knows if that's actually the case? There's been an argument that consciousness, or the ability to experience reality, that ability is emerges from the brain, and other people claim that the brain is somehow tapping into some other system that exists in nature, like some force that's not currently understood. And with current science, there's actually no way to tell which one of those is true. Either one of those could be true. Most people assume that it's emergent from the brain, but the only thing that a neuron is really doing, it might be doing other things that allow consciousness to emerge that's different than what we see it doing. But what we see neurons doing is they transmit chemicals from one nerve to another, and those chemicals cause an electrical signal to get passed down the next neuron down the line, which then, when that signal reaches the tip of that neuron, it transmits a chemical signal to the next neuron. So it's really just a yes-no. It's an on-off signal, just like in a computer. The zeros and ones is very much how the nervous system works. And other organisms convey that as well. Inside of a cell, you have really complex computations that are happening. And my guest on here, it's going to be in 2 weeks, he's going to be talking about that. He's going to be talking about the cell from an engineering perspective, all of the things that are happening inside of a cell. And to think about these in terms of communication, to think about these chemical reactions in terms of communication and signaling is a really neat way to think about it, because it really is what's happening. The spectacular thing about life is that we have communication systems inside of communication systems inside of communication systems. And it's these interactions that make life so unique. You don't have to think of life that way. You can think of it from just normal chemistry. But we really do have these evolved systems where you do have symbols. Testosterone is not causing the cell to change its behavior. It's interacting with a sensor on the outside of the cell, a molecule on the outside of the cell, and a chain reaction with a bunch of molecules that have evolved to cause this chain reaction, under selection pressure to cause this chain reaction. That's what's causing this. There's nothing in physics that says testosterone needs to change a cell's reaction. This is evolved. This is a system that has evolved. And that is really spectacular. I think if I've missed questions, please resend. Oh, there's one more from plants shouldn't have consciousness if a brain is needed for it. Yeah, I would agree. But plants do have complex signaling, so a brain really is just a signaling system, so far as we can tell. It's an information processing system, and a cell is also an information processing system. You can think of it that way. It is processing information from the outside and changing its response in accordance to that information. And a plant's body is doing that too. And the weird question about consciousness is, I experience consciousness. The thinking part of my brain experiences consciousness. It's possible that what I call the subconscious part of my brain is actually experiencing something just as lively, but this part of my brain that I'm using to experience my life, the storytelling part of my brain doesn't have access to its consciousness. There might be closed systems of consciousness even within the human brain, and there might be something similar to consciousness. Physicists are arguing this, philosophers are debating this, biochemists are debating this. Is there consciousness in a cell, or something you could call consciousness in a cell? What do we mean by that word? Like, this is this is a mystery in science. So I wouldn't jump to conclusions to say that a plant does not have consciousness. I would say that so far as we know, a plant certainly doesn't have consciousness the way that you and I do. They're not thinking about stuff and then responding, and they're not worrying about things. But we don't know if a plant experiences its existence. We don't know. We just don't know. And we don't know if a cell experiences its existence. So that things start to get a little woo-woo here when we talk about consciousness, because it's so misunderstood. It is a mystery. So let me get back to my slides here. I've got a couple more. I'm running along on today's lesson, but this is really interesting stuff to me. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. And I've never done a proper, I want to put together a proper, edited lesson on all this stuff. It needs to happen. I just haven't done it yet. But so signaling, as I've been saying, is fundamental to life. Absolutely fundamental. Some people say it's really the thing that distinguishes living from non-living. And so these are two cells that are, actually, I forgot what this slide is. I think these are immune cells attacking some pathogen. Yeah, those are definitely immune cells. I don't know what they're doing there, but they use signals to communicate to each other. Like, we've got a bad guy in here, we need to kill it. And they pick up on cues from the pathogen that, oh, there's a pathogen in here. This thing does not belong. So there's cue detection and signaling happening here between white blood cells. And a lot of this I've already talked about in this Q&A. So, hormones are tissue-to-tissue signals transmitted through the blood. This is a signaling system that has evolved between cells. Bacteria signal to coordinate many behaviors. They can signal to each other. They can signal between members of the same species. They can pick up on cues from members of other species, and they will change their behavior accordingly. And in some cases, there is reason to suspect that they probably have interspecies communication, so they actually have evolved signals between each other. But most likely, signals, it's easier for signaling to evolve between members of the same species than between different species. But we do think there's probably some cross-species signaling because they live in quite complex groups and ecosystems. The genetic code is a signaling system, and with symbols that have evolved. So this is the genetic code chart. This tells you what the nucleotides, they come together to create codons, and those codons are signals that represent different amino acids that are to be used by the ribosome to create a protein. And I apologize if everything I said to you is gibberish there. I do have a video series called What is DNA and How Does It Work that will help clarify that. Your functional bits are mostly protein, and the thing that the genetic code is doing, it's a signaling system between chains of RNA where they communicate with each other how to build different proteins. So yeah, they're chains of amino acids. And the amino acids are just these molecules, right? So here's aspartic acid. This is what the actual molecule looks like in space-filling form. And this is a nucleotide. These are the nucleotides of DNA. I'm just rushing through these slides here because we're kind of running over time here. But this is what a nucleotide looks like in space-filling form. So we had that amino acid. That's what the amino acid looks like. That's what the nucleotide looks like. And in the genetic code, 3 nucleotides on a chain of DNA or RNA is actually what's sent to the ribosome to actually act in the communication. 3 of them make a codon, and they are a symbol telling the ribosome to grab a glycine from its environment and add it to the growing protein chain. So the symbols encoded in the chain of RNA are understood, you could say, understood in quotes, because there's no brain there, but the ribosome has evolved. It's actually using transfer RNA to interpret the messenger RNA, and it knows that the system knows the rules are set up in advance that a guanine in the messenger RNA. I'm really stumbling here. I apologize. A guanine in the messenger RNA represents a glycine. And so it grabs a glycine out of its surrounding, adds it to the protein chain, and then it reads the next 3 nucleotides in the messenger RNA, and it grabs whatever amino acid is symbolized in the communication system for it to grab. So this is a genuine communication system that exists at the heart of biology, and it's the oldest, the most ancient communication system that exists, and it is universal, almost universal in all organisms. This codon chart here, this chart is slightly different in different species. The symbols are slightly different in different species, but for the most part, it is the same. When I say different species, I mean certain bacteria use a slightly different version than animals do, but all animals use the same version. So, I actually have a talk on what is the genetic code that's on this channel, where I go over these slides in more detail and without so much stuttering. So I suggest going over that. But in short, the flow of coded genetic information goes from DNA in the modern system, goes from DNA to messenger RNA. It is modified and encoded into messenger RNA that is transmitted to the ribosome, and that tells the ribosome how to build specific proteins. And so we have a signaling system that is just like what we learn about in information theory. So you've got an information source. In this case, the ultimate source of the information in the genetic code is evolution, but it's that the stored source is DNA. That is encoded by a transmitter, but the nucleus encodes that into messenger RNA and transmits that out to the ribosome. The ribosome receives that and decodes that information into protein. And this is the encoding and decoding system, the rules that govern the encoding and decoding, they evolved over evolutionary time to be what they are today. And we think that they evolved probably in some sort of an RNA world scenario where the first evolving entities were chains of RNA, and they were under evolutionary pressure to cooperate to build proteins, and increasingly specific proteins as time went on. And so different symbols developed in that communication system between different chains of RNA. The ribosome is a chain of RNA. It is a chunk of RNA that folds up into a 3-dimensional shape and acts as an enzyme. It can actually take those amino acids and combine them into a protein chain. And that system, we believe, evolved, and this is quite a bit more speculation than we would like right now. This has not been demonstrated to a degree that's really satisfying, but our best speculation right now is that communication system evolved among RNA chains that were replicating, undergoing Darwinian evolution. So descent with modification acted upon by natural selection, and they evolved this communication system that became more and more complex as time went on, until you have this really sophisticated genetic system that ended up taking off, and all organisms now use this same system, essentially the same system. So, that is today's lesson. Everything from the genetic code to the colors of a flower to the words that I'm uttering right now, these are symbols in communication systems that in many cases have evolved, and in some cases have been invented, or not necessarily invented. English was not invented, right? It emerged between humans who were trying to cooperate with each other. So languages, these communication systems, the rules that govern communication systems, they can evolve through evolution, through natural selection, or they can be generated by thinking organisms that are trying to cooperate with each other. And in all cases, this is the result of cooperation. It evolves when different evolving entities are under selection pressure to cooperate, and it emerges when different thinking entities are under pressure to cooperate. So there we go. Signaling theory combined with information theory. And this will really help set us up for our conversation on looking at the cell from an engineering perspective here in 2 weeks. And again, next week we will have a conversation about the origin of life from a Christian who studies origin of life chemistry. He's an actual researcher. I've been working with him for since 2012, doing animations on the origin of life. And he's a really cool guy, Jay Forsythe. And I'm very excited for this week's lineup. But that is it for now. Well, actually, let me just see if we got any questions here. Any last minute questions? Plants respond to a dark place and know to go vertical. That is through, they do have sensors. Plants do have sensors that can detect light, and they've got a system that causes them to grow towards light. Human signals to other humans via cough, runny nose, and red eyes that they are sick. Are viruses, bacteria evolving to make us more asymptomatic? So we are not signaling in those cases. We are sending out cues, and other humans can detect those cues. So remember, the difference between a signal and a cue is that a cue is a passive transmission. A signal is an active transmission. And that can be a little bit, there's kind of a blurred line there. But if I were exaggerating my sneezes to get attention, then I would be sending out a signal. If I was actively exaggerating the sound of my sneeze. If I was just sneezing, I'm just sending out a cue. So are viruses and bacteria evolving to make us more asymptomatic? The sneeze is the best way to be transmitted. So a cough and a sneeze actually throws a virus out into the atmosphere, and that's how it's transmitted. You could, if a population becomes super terrified of sneezes and coughs, which we now are, you could have selection pressure for them to evolve more through, transmit more through surfaces and so on. And so they might actually, you could have evolutionary pressure that would cause them to hide themselves better. But I don't know of any studies on actual observations of that. But yeah, in theory, that could happen. Let's see. For feeding my information addiction. Thank you. Oh, yeah, you're welcome, Tim Smith. And if you have a last minute question, do @stated space casually, and I'll make sure that I see that. I'm getting some thank yous. People have been talking about training, positive reinforcement, and clicker training. The click, the reason that bird trainers, I say bird trainers because I used to train birds with a clicker. The reason that animal trainers use a clicker is because it is a signal that you can tell the animal, hey, you just did what I wanted you to, I'm going to give you a reward. And the clicker is a signal that never changes. So if you're giving out verbal signals to an animal, your voice might be different every day. You might say it slightly different every day. It's hard for that animal to really grasp everything, especially animals that are not very sound oriented. Humans are sound oriented and visually oriented. Other animals might not be. So the clicker is so distinct. That's why people use a clicker when they're training. It's a little clicking device that makes a very distinct clicking noise that pretty much any animal can figure out. That weird noise means I did something good, and so I'm going to get rewarded. So that's why it's a shortcut to developing a communication system between a human and another animal. Aki side channel says, I sent you an email on how DNA came about. I have not seen that yet, but I will look for that. Any other questions here? Well, it looks like that's it. I'm going to wrap up. I've been going for almost 2 hours. So, yeah. So long for now, everybody. Thank you. This was wonderful. And I will see you next week with my guest, Jay Forsythe.